Hello, and welcome to a bonus box of Warhammer 40k's Grim History from Beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and today we're going to talk about one of the greatest stories of the Horus Heresy that took place immediately after the Drop Sight Massacre on Istvaan 5. A moment in time that I call the Raven's War.
Our story starts as dusk begins to settle on Istvaan 5 after the Drop Sight Massacre. Now, all that remains among Imperial records about the first night after the Drop Sight Massacre is scattered in fragmentary accounts, many of them entirely contradictory. Some survivors spoke of tides of traitors surging across the hills in a berserk frenzy, howling for the blood of the survivors. Others describe a deep, sonorous chanting that rolled through the valleys like thunder and stirred dread in the hearts of those still loyal to the Emperor. Still other evidence shows bands of traitors descending on isolated loyalists and tearing them apart in brutal savagery, while circling gunships loosed fire indiscriminately, little caring of who they slew so long as it was not their own. How many battles raged throughout the night cannot be known, for every loyalist legionary fought his own bitter war for survival. Even as the main body of the foe harried the surviving Raven Guard Astartes from behind, others fell upon them from above as they passed along cracked ravines. Few legionaries had any ammunition to spare, and so most of these battles were fought with fists and combat knives. When individual Raven Guards fell, their brothers made impossibly valiant attempts to rescue them from the howling, blood-maddened foes. Those who could walk bore those who could not, the withdrawal ever teetering on the edge of being overthrown. But by the time the wan light of Istvaan 5's sun appeared on the horizon, barely penetrating the tortured, smoke-stained skies, the bulk of the surviving Raven Guard had broken free of their pursuers, finding sanctuary in a maze-like ravines beyond the Urgol Hills, for a brief moment at least. As the Raven Guard were fighting alongside their Primarch, those remaining loyalist legionaries, unable to escape the noose of the traitor armies, were being systematically butchered. As the tides of war receded, the traitors stalked the battlefield, knee-deep in the shattered bodies of their erstwhile kinsmen, seeking the dying that they might deliver death anew. Others sought the wounded in order to perform abominable tortures upon their already ruined flesh. Some traitor legions piled their own dead onto great pyres so that their deaths might be honored as the growing flames licked the blackened skies. The World Eaters are known to have performed one of the basest acts of savagery that day by butchering the dead and dying, decapitating them, flensing the flesh from their skulls, and piling these in massive ossuary cairns. The Word-Bearers, following the teachings of their damned Primarch Lorgar, enacted their own victory rituals, the terrible significance of which is now all too well known to the Imperium. As if to heap infamy upon ignominy, the traitors began another, still worse mutilation of the fallen. Tens of thousands of corpses had their progenoid glands, the implant that bears the Space Marines' gene seed by which the legions themselves were propagated, torn bloodily from them, for what fell purposes few would dare speculate at the time. While hordes of traitors closed in on the now isolated Raven Lord and the storm of fire scything through the air, a single Raven Guard Thunderhawk, the Umbra Secundus, commandeered by the 19th Legion's Master of Descent Alvarex Mon, successfully descended from the fire-streaked skies against the odds, and blasted a landing zone near the Primarch. Having boarded, Corax remained at the open assault ramp, and it is said his black eyes burned as he cursed the numberless hosts, even as the gunship rose once more, the backblast of its rockets engines making a pyre for the betrayed dead that fought to the last alongside their lord. Inevitably, the sheer weight of fire directed at the Thunderhawk shredded its armor skin, tore one wing off, and ripped its cockpit canopy wide open, slaying both pilot and co-pilot in an instant. Wrestling with the rune controls even as the cockpit burned around him, Strike Captain Mon fought to arrest the stricken gunship's terminal descent, turning what would have been a catastrophic crash into a controlled landing. Though most of the crew were slain and the strike captain badly wounded, the Primarch survived thanks to Alvarex Mon's dedication and sacrifice. The two rejoined the Legion as the sun finally set on that great day of betrayal. Even as the Raven Guard slipped their howling pursuers, yet another torment was visited upon the war-shattered surface of Istvaan 5. The flaming hulks of those loyalist warships caught in the traitors' ambush now began their inexorable and fatal descent. Soon the first large fragments of wreckage speared downwards and smashed into the ground with force equal to a planetary bombardment. The resulting explosion scoured a crater 100 meters across and sent up a mushroom cloud tens of thousands of meters into the atmosphere. Moments later, searing debris ran down, and a wave front of ash and smoke smothered all. It would be the first of many hundreds of impacts that would fall upon the embattled planet's surface over the coming solar days, weeks, and months, wreaking indiscriminate destruction upon loyalists and traitor alike. With the wreckage falling from orbit overwhelming the Voxnet with impenetrable interference and the choking debris drastically curtailing visibility, the surviving Raven Guard pressed even deeper into the cracked land beyond the Urgal Hills, a vast, broken region called the Ilium Rifts. By dusk on the second day, little had been learned of the fate of the Iron Hands and the Salamanders, and so Corax was seen to pace the outer limits of the rifts, his gaze dark, his humor swinging violently between choler and melancholy. Several times he led his chosen warriors out into the hills in search of his lost Raven Guard sons, and any other loyalist force who might survive yet. Several times he returned with Raven Guard legionaries, having come upon them in the hills. Signs of other loyalist survivors having broken free of the massacre at the Urgal Depression were found all about, many in the form of tracks terminating in broken corpses of once proud warriors run to ground like cornered animals. Throughout the night, still more scattered bands of Raven Guards staggered into the refuge, many wounded almost beyond the ability to fight, in body and mind as well. Of all the horrors they had witnessed, of all the hurts they had withstood during the wars of the Great Crusade, here was an entirely new phenomenon. The betrayal that had split the legionnaires Astartes in twain had inflicted upon them a wound no other foe had ever struck. For the first time in the experience of any present, their vaunted spirit, wrought by the hand of the Emperor himself, was stretched to a breaking point. Under the unheeded gaze of the vigilant Raven Guard, the traitor's intent unfurled. Ultra-heavy transport barques descended from the still churning skies. The heaviest were large enough to embark the mighty traitor titans, while hundreds more would ferry the bulk of the traitor legion's line units into orbit and away to the next phase of the War Master's betrayal. Far-ranging Raven Guard reconnaissance squads reported to the Raven Lord that the bulk of each turncoat legion appeared to be departing, but that each appeared to be leaving behind it a corps of warriors. To what ends they could not determine. The only legion not taking its leave was the World Eaters, whose traitor death squads ranged the hills and vast beyond, ever seeking to run more loyalist survivors to ground, and to add more flint skulls to the growing ossuary cairns. Angron, it seemed, would not depart Istvaan 5 until the slaughter was complete. Confronted with the stark reality of the strategic situation, the Raven Guard fell back upon their instilled battle doctrines. Corax instigated a cunningly conceived series of diversionary attacks that drew traitor hunters away from the gorges of the Ilium Rifts, in which the Raven Guard had taken refuge, and led them away into the mountains and deserts north and south of the Urgal Depression. Raven Guard squads ranged far and wide in the course of these actions, sometimes returning with more survivors, more often with fresh wounds and fell accounts of the sights they had seen. The traitor death squads were hunting down survivors as if engaging in sport, and enacting unspeakable tortures upon the bodies of those they ran to ground. Many loyalist survivors began to display signs of psychotic break, turning upon their own brothers with unreasoning savagery. Soon enough, the phenomenon was repeated. A number of legionaries who had once served in the Librarius approached the Raven Lord with their suspicions. Even without consciously engaging their psychic skills, they had detected a slow but inexorable buildup of psionic pressure. At first, they had taken the effect for a manifestation of so much violent choler unleashed in such a concentrated period and location during the Drop Sight Massacre. Yet, as the days wore on, it had become increasingly apparent that something far darker and contrary to reason was occurring. It was the work of the World Eaters, and represented yet another sign of just how far the traitors had fallen. All across the Urgal Depression and beyond, the World Eaters were raising even taller pyramids of flint skulls. At first, they appeared random in form and function. though redolent of the death fanes and ossuary temples cast down on the most savage of human worlds during the Great Crusade. The act of gathering the skulls of the fallen, flensing them, and piling them into vast pyramids all across the Urgal Depression, and even further into the hills, was revealed as some form of rite of victory. Somehow, this rite was proving to be the source of madness that afflicted the rescued Raven Guard and many others who tarried overlong in the shadow of the monuments. Some manner of psychic resonance was pulsing outward from the vile monuments, filling those it touched with anger and bloodlust. Later on, a Raven Guard reconnaissance squad would witness their erstwhile allies performing savage victory rituals around the monuments, confirming to many that the sons of Angron remained at heart no more than bloodthirsty primitives. Others saw in the rituals something far darker, something spawned long ago in the darkness of old night, the barbarism and savagery of the Age of Strife. It would be several years until the true nature of the phenomenon was revealed. Though their Primarch may have known more, the Raven Guard were blissfully ignorant of such things at the time. Though even then, it was obvious that some agency beyond the natural order of reality was abroad. Keeping his own counsel on the matter, the Raven Guard Primarch ordered a series of attacks against a small select number of these vile structures, strike forces of chosen warriors planting melta-bombs at their bases. The resulting detonation brought the targets crashing down in cleansing flame, and the fell psychic effects that exerted on the surrounding legions lessened, though it never entirely relented. As the battles in Istvaan 5 wore on, Corax reorganized his legion, forging it anew into something resembled less the brutalized victims of Horus's betrayal and more a band of warriors determined to survive, or to sell their lives dearly in the attempt. Raven Guard strike forces launched a series of cautious, yet bold attacks against traitor death squads isolated from the greater mass of the enemy, numerous small but bitterly fought battles out in the wastes. Many of these confrontations were fought with combat knives and improvised weapons, the object to slay the foe and carry away what supplies could be salvaged from their bodies. In time, ammunition stocks were replenished to such a degree that more overt assaults could be launched, and it was as small groups of Raven Guard pushed ever deeper into the traitor-haunted lands about the Urgal Depression that a grim discovery indeed was made. Along the crest of the Urgal Depression, hundreds, perhaps even thousands of iron spikes and columns were found, driven into the black volcanic ground. Atop each was mounted the body, or body part, of a loyalist space marine. Most had been executed, while others lived on still, the transhuman psiology of the Legiones Astartes, holding death at bay despite being eviscerated, impaled, dismembered, or having 100 other equally cruel and darkly invented injuries inflicted upon them. It was to the eyes of the loyalist onlookers as if some plague of insanity had spread from their former brothers, that alongside treachery as terrible as it was, something of horror and madness, unlooked for the inhuman had taken root. Here was the fate that the traitors would inflict upon every loyalist not slain in the cauldron of the Drop Sight Massacre. Here, the Raven Guard recognized, was the fate that Horus would visit upon all those who refused to bow before him, even should every human world drown in blood. In the east, Raven Guard scouts came upon a vast and hidden underground complex, akin to the alien Estevanian ruins, which the traitors had used as their dread fastness. With this discovery, the Raven Guard had their sanctuary, and operations to relocate began within solar hours. The move could not have been more well-timed, for as the last of the Raven Guard moved out, the night skies far to the west filled with the fires of massed retro jets. A vast flotilla of vessels was landing in the calderas of the extinct volcanoes over the western horizon, a flotilla belonging to the War Master Traitor Mechanicum allies. From the cavernous hulls of the gargantuan Mechanicum vessels marched cohorts of Traitor Mechanicum tech helots, and thousands upon thousands of servitors and tech thralls were driven forth towards the wreckage-strewn Urgal Depression. Horus's renegade tech priests were beginning a reclamation operation of staggering scale, one that would grant the War Master an immediate advantage in supply and material. The entire depression was strewn with the equipment of incredible military worth, even those vehicles and other items damaged beyond repair still of enormous value as salvage. The wrecks of hundreds of super heavy tanks still smoldered there, while the toppled forms of once mighty titans were testament to the sheer destruction unleashed in the few hours of the Drop Sight Massacre. The ground was carpeted with the remains of hundreds of thousands of Space Marines, each of whom still bore full Legiones Astartes battle plate and carried weapons and other items of equipment representing the very pinnacle of human technological achievement. Within solar hours, the flickering glow of plasma cutters was to be seen all across the Depression as Dark Mechanicum reclamation parties began their grim harvest. The operation would continue for many solar weeks, pushing outwards across the Depression until, at length, only the worthless scraps of war remained. Even weeks after the Drop Sight Massacre, still living bodies would be discovered in amongst the thousands of dead. The gene-enhanced physiology of the Legiones Astartes, able to enter a state of suspended animation in which the body might heal from the most horrendous wounds in time. Some traitors, most notably elements of the Word-Bearers and the Emperor's Children, in whom, it seemed, the dark madness of nightmare had truly awakened, but whose true cause was not yet suspected by outsiders, took cruel delight when these were discovered, sometimes administering chemical preparations to awaken them, only to torture and execute the unfortunate victims, exacting upon them what amounted to a second death. The Sons of the Raven did what they could to disrupt the work of these reclamation parties, even while seeking to avoid their own capture and torturous end. Dozens of tech priests overseers fell, victims to the silent sniper rounds of Legion seekers determined to exact vengeance for the dark crimes witnessed through their targeting scopes, or found explosive booby traps to their would-be prizes of salvage. But ultimately, such counterattacks were mere pinpricks to the vast scavenging efforts the traitors had undertaken. Now, around the 20th solar day after the Drop Sight Massacre, the 19th Legion's fight for survival entered a new and bitter phase. By this point, the traitors were aware that a significant force of loyalists survived yet, and had made a number of attempts to bring them to battle. Corax, however, was not to be drawn into an open confrontation, as his heavily reduced forces had no chance of winning. Instead, he executed a series of strikes designed to divert and disrupt the enemy's operations, and challenge their domain of the wastes surrounding the Urgal Depression. The greater number of traitors left behind to scour the world belonged to the World Eaters Legion, led by their savage Primarch Angron. Despite the loyalist actions, the World Eaters rarely split their forces, instead scouring the Depression and the waste beyond in a vast and ravaging mass, their war cries audible for many miles all about. The other, smaller Traitor Legion contingents deployed differently, however, leading the Raven Guard to the conclusion that those left behind Istvaan 5 were some sort of punishment detail, or else represented elements of the traitor legions their Primarch had decided to keep apart from the bulk of their forces. This hypothesis was further evidenced as a number of these remaining traitor contingents were revealed to be fractious and ill-disciplined, the glory and nobility of the Emperor's Great Crusade apparently forgotten to them. The Sons of Horus were often encountered in small bands of hunters, most accompanied by cyber mastiffs, able to detect the proximity of even the stealthiest of Raven Guard warriors, and to track them across many miles. The Word-Bearers, by comparison, follow their own unknowable ritualistic dogma, and often stay clear even of their supposed traitor allies. Perhaps because these actions would have prompted too many questions they would prefer not to answer of their brothers-in-arms. The Iron Warriors contingent, smaller but well provided for in terms of heavy vehicles and war machinery, scour the wastes in compact armored columns, the largest three of which presented Corax with the opportunity he had been seeking. The Raven Lord's campaign against the Iron Warriors' armored columns was to last several solar weeks, and heralded some of the most intense fighting prior to the very final battles of Istvaan 5. After many weeks of gathering vital intelligence, Corax mustered his forces north of the Urgal Depression and sprung an ambush against the smallest of the three Iron Warriors' armored columns. After striking the surprised traitors, they quickly withdrew, leaving behind corpses of several hundred traitors and guttering hulks of dozens of vehicles. Though this battle paled into insignificance compared to the losses the traitors had inflicted upon the Loyalists at the Drop Sight Massacre and afterwards, in terms of morale, it could not have been more important. The Raven Guard had struck a meaningful blow against the traitors, and even if every son of Corax eventually died on the blasted surfaces of Istvaan 5, they would do so vindicated and with honor. As Corax and several of the more Dithan watched the rear as the main body withdrew, they witnessed a phalanx of walkers. their form unfamiliar, but clearly the product of some historic discipline practiced by Horus's traitor Mechanicum allies. This was the first recorded sighting of the war engines that would come to be known as
the Blind Hunters,
a class of mechanical automaton possessed of dark intelligence and fearsome array of weaponry, and intended to hunt down every last survivor left upon the surface of Istvaan 5. Their existence and presence on the planet at that juncture was further evidence of the staggering scope and scale of Horus's treachery. The Raven Guard had but solar days to consolidate after their victory before another Iron Warriors column was reported pressing eastward across the wastes, winding its way into the twisting ravines of the Ilium rifts. Corax ordered an immediate and overwhelming attack. The battle that ensued took place in the abyssal darkness of the ravines, and was as bitterly fought as any boarding action or hive scouring the 19th Legion had ever undertaken. The Primarch was everywhere to be found at the heart of the fight, while the jump pack equipped units made wide outflanking maneuvers so that the Iron Warriors were cut off, attacked from multiple directions with no hope of retreat. The Iron Warriors gave not an inch, even as their dead choked the gullies. Though less than 100 Iron Warriors remained, they were bolstered by a dozen dreadnoughts of varying patterns. From the Loyalist mist strode the Raven Lord, as he faced off against the Contemptor pattern dreadnought in close quarter combat. A single word passed between them, the Primarch speaking the name of an Iron Warrior veteran within the Contemptor, evidence that the two had fought alongside one another during the Great Crusade. This curse spoken, the two squared off against one another in a manner of pit fighters preparing to fight to the death. Quickly leaping onto the dreadnought's back, the Raven Lord made short work of it, as he tore into the Contemptor's ceramite armored shell and pulled out the armored brain case and trailing spinal column of the veteran Iron Warrior legionary who had been entered within the sarcophagus. A moment later, the Contemptor systems disengaged and the once mighty war machine collapsed, the Primarch leaping clear before it hit the ground. This was the signal to attack. In the ensuing conflict, the Raven Guard leapt from the dawn to fall upon the belingered Iron Warriors, the Primarch engaging several more dreadnoughts as his assault squad cut into the enemy legionaries. Not a single Iron Warrior legionary was allowed to escape, and in truth, none attempted to do so, each fighting until the bitter end. Eventually, silence descended upon the scene. The rocky floor of the crater carpeted in the broken bodies of over 100 Iron Warriors, and not a small number of Raven Guard. In amongst the wreckage were the ruined, smoking hulks of a dozen dreadnoughts, the remains of once mighty heroes, entered within cast to the bloody ground by the vengeful Primarch of the Raven Guard. His contempt for the scope of their fall from grace was writ across his grim visage. With a nod, the Raven Lord gave the signal for his forces to withdraw. The dead left in their wake as a powerful message to the traitors. It would not be the last of its kind. As the shadows of resistance and search, hard-fought ambush, and flight wore on, the presence of increasing numbers of word-bearers within the Ilium rifts made it apparent that the traitors were pushing their hunt for survivors ever further outwards, once again threatening the safety of the 19th Legion's sanctuary. Steps were taken to move the Legion's wounded, as well as its meager stores and limited command facilities, ever deeper into the mighty chain of caverns beneath the rifts. The further the Raven Guard pressed into the Stygian darkness, the more apparent the alien nature of the tunnels became. The material that the cavern's walls were comprised of appeared to have a deadening effect on the wide band of electromagnetic radiation. Furthermore, the construction seemed to be exerting an influence on the psionic level 2, serving to nullify or shroud psychic effects. This may have contributed to the traitors' inability to locate the Loyalist refuge using technological or psionic means, but many claim it must have done so, for the traitors scoured the lands above but never discovered it using these methods, despite passing within yards of the entrances on several occasions. One particular group was not searching using any subtle or historic methods. The third Iron Warrior's armored column forged eastward, crushing all it encountered in its ceaseless hunt. Set on a course that would take them directly past the number of hidden entrances to the Raven Guard's refuge, it was judged a certainty that the Iron Warriors might discover, by dogged search or blind chance, what their fellow traitors had failed to locate by more subtle means. Faced with the likelihood of imminent discovery, the Raven Lord mustered all available warriors and committed themselves to a daring assault, sweeping in upon the traitors with hatred welling in their hearts. The Iron Warriors responded with implacable ferocity, but were soon engaged in a bitter, grueling contest from which only one side would emerge. Even as his sons fought on, mired in the blood of friend and foe alike, the Raven Lord plunged into the cauldron of war alone, his single lightning claw lashing out in great thirsty sweeps. The third and final portion of the Iron Warriors' Legion left behind to scour Istvaan V of the Loyalists was utterly destroyed. And while others of their kin remained in the Urgal Hills, manning their fortifications as a coherent force of aggression, the sons of Perturabo were spent. As the Raven Guard marched wearily back towards the sanctuary in silence, the harrowing horns of the traitor Mechanicum blind hunters echoed out across the cracked wastes, and black storm clouds gathered in the gray skies overhead. At the last, the clouds broke, and black tainted rain fell upon the blood-crusted surface of Istvaan V. As the black rains lashed the wastes, it enforced a temporary cessation of hostilities, and the traitors pulled back from the grim hunt. The Raven Guard took the opportunity to consolidate in their sanctuary. For several solar days, the Legion's officers reconstituted and reorganized while the apothecaries tended to wounds, long neglected in the midst of constant war. At the height of the rains, Corax once again took his leave into the rain-blasted gullies without a word of explanation. Those legionaries who knew the Primarch of old counseled the others to fret not, for it was well within the Raven Lord's demeanor to act alone in such circumstances, utilizing his unique Emperor-gifted abilities to pass unseen where few others could. History does not record where the dark-eyed Primarch walked, for what grim sights he bore witness to during the day and night he went alone across the wastes. Fragmented accounts, compiled much later based on his conversation with Rogel Dorn, hint that Corax penetrated deep into traitor-held territory, perhaps even treading the corpse-carpeted Urgal Depression itself. When at last the Primarch returned, he convened a council of his most trusted senior commanders, and while the words that passed between them go unrecorded, the Primarch's intent remains unequivocal. The Raven Guard must survive, he ordained, not simply to preserve the Imperium's might, although that must surely have been a consideration. Rather, while but a single Raven Guard continued to fight, no traitor could rest without fear that justice would be visited upon him. The records show that in the aftermath of the long-contaminated rainfall, a dense, stinging fog, reeking of chemical-rich blood, rose from the broken ground to blanket hundreds of square miles. This all-pervading taint of death, which can perhaps be said, in retrospect, to have some warp taint infecting it thanks to the Word-Bearer Legion's dark ministrations, took its toll on many of the Raven Guard, stretching the sanity of many even further towards the breaking point. As Astartes, not a single Space Marine would surrender to cowardice or weakness of will. Yet the apocalyptic slaughter and the cumulative effect of solar weeks of fighting, combined with little or no rest or sustenance, and the need to wreak bloody vengeance upon the heads of traitors, caused many to descend into a twilight existence somewhere between exhaustion and rage, denial and defection. Under the relentless pressure, even a Space Marine takes a haggard cast. The already pale, hollow-eyed Raven Guard coming to appear as armored vagabonds. Their battle plate a haphazard amalgamation of replacement parts, scavenged from the dead, of any and all the legions present on Istvaan V. At some point around the 40th day after the Drop Sight Massacre, a large force of word-bearers, under the command of the war leader Alexis, penetrated the ravines to the north of the Raven Guard Legion's sanctuary. Alexis had discerned that the Raven Guard forces he had encountered earlier were part of a larger force, and he was determined to claim their heads for himself. It is noteworthy that Alexis appears to have withheld his suspicions from the other traitor factions, in particular the World Eaters, whose Primarch Angron still scoured the far wastes in search of one or both of his lost brothers. Had he done so, there is little doubt the traitor's assault would have been a direct and brutal one, far from the cunning infiltration from an unanticipated quarter that was in the event launched. On this occasion, the Raven Guard did not launch an all-out attack to repel the infiltration. Instead, the word-bearers were allowed to penetrate many miles into the ravines and the twisted gullies while the Raven Guard watched on from the shadows, allowing the word-bearers to pass by as other units feigned retreat in the face of the traitor's advance. Eventually, the trap was set, and the Raven Guard launched their ambush. At a stroke, dozens of separate word-bearer units were engaged, none of them able to lend aid to their brothers. The aim of the ambush was twofold. In addition to cutting down hundreds of their hated foe, the Raven Guard were able to capture several of the traitors, though all but one were able to take their own lives before they were subdued. The sole remaining traitor was brought before Corax, a circle of Raven Guard forming about the base of an ancient crater where the traitor was cast as the skies of unnatural lightning and the black rains came down once more. None would dare speak of the manner in which the Primarch and his officers questioned the traitor, nor of the nature of the death he was afforded at the last. Soon after, though, a stream of orders were disseminated through the 19th Legion, and from these certain facts had been pieced together. It was confirmed that Angron was the only traitor Primarch who had remained on Istvaan 5, and that his World Eaters represented the only traitor legion still deployed in full strength, the remainder having left behind only limited contingents to hunt down the last remaining loyalists. Perhaps the most vital information extracted from the traitor was that Angron was aware that Corax still lived, and was intent upon scouring the entire Ilium Rift in order to bring him to battle. A massive assault was being prepared, one that the Word-Bearer's commander Alexis had attempted to preempt for his own glory and failed. Forewarned of the imminent attack, the Raven Guard made immediate preparations to relocate once more. Some amongst their ranks spoke out against retreating in the face of the enemy, advocating to make a defiant last stand. The line officers quelled such opinions the instant they were voiced, but it was inevitable that the 19th Legion's upper echelon officers and the Primarch himself should hear of them. When this happened, the reaction was curt and uncompromising. The Raven Guard would live and die at the word of the Primarch alone. If the end was to come, it would be at a time and place of his choosing, and none other. The evacuation of the sanctuary could not have been more timely or fortuitous. For even as the Raven Guard's rear guard units cast a final glance westward over their shoulders, they spied its demise. A cohort of blind hunters was closing in on the hidden main entrance, the baleful dirge of their harrowing horns blasting out across the wastes. In the wake of the fell war machines came the great mass of Legiones Astartes, the filthy, blood-encrusted white and blue livery of the World Eaters, easily visible against the gray sky and black ground. At the last, Corax himself joined the rearguard and watched silently as the land was swallowed into a mass of explosions. The savage sons of Angron setting the region aflame in their anger at having discovered their prey had escaped them yet again. In the aftermath of the evacuation of the sanctuary, the Raven Guard Legion's fight for survival and vengeance entered a final, desperate phase, where before the 19th Legion had been able to exert some control over their fate, albeit one that could not be maintained forever. Now they were victims of circumstance once more. The Raven Guard numbered even fewer warriors than they had in the immediate aftermath of the Drop Sight Massacre. 80 solar days or more of continuous battle and hardships, having claimed hundreds more. Many of the most severely wounded legionaries evacuated from the sanctuary had taken their own lives so that their brethren might not be burdened by them, despite the efforts and protestations of their kin. With this, a deep melancholy settled upon the Raven Guard, who had never been a cheerful kindred, even at the height of victory. Individual legionaries became sullen and withdrawn, as grim acceptance of the inevitable took hold. Though the Raven Guard Legion fought on against any and all traitors it encountered, many fought because the only alternative was to die, not because they cleaved to any hope or eventual victory. The fighting was continuous. The only difference was that now the remains of the 19th Legion had no refuge other than the twisting ravines of the Ilium Rifts, and it soon became apparent that there was a scant chance of locating another refuge, for the World Eaters and the Dark Mechanicum Blind Hunters were relentless in their efforts to bring the Raven Guard to battle. Though they remained one step ahead, the Raven Guard were rarely afforded the time needed to properly reconnoiter the path ahead or to formulate a strategy to counter the traitors' incessant attacks. Try as they might, the Raven Guard could not wrest the initiative from the traitors, a situation entirely anathema to them. Step by step, the Raven Guard were pressed ever eastward. Inevitably, they would eventually be driven into the trackless, inhospitable Guller Salt Plains. An uncharted land even the superhuman psiology of the Legiones Astartes would not withstand over long. As the battles raged, the western skies flickered star-white as the traitor Mechanicum incinerated the regions they had cleared of salvageable material. Grim-faced, the Raven Guard could only fight on as the destruction spread ever outward from the Urgal Depression, breaking like a wave over the Urgal Hills and spewing mile after mile across the wastes and into the Ilium rifts beyond. For long days and nights, the Raven Guard fought on in this manner, selling their lives dearly as the waste echoed with the sound of Angron bellowing for his brother to face him. The salt plains grew ever closer to the east as the raging fires consumed the western skies, crept ever onwards. Though the Raven Guard fought on, they were by now outnumbered 10-1 and had no hope of reinforcement or resupply. With the inexorable march of the Traitor Mechanicum's land-raising firestorms, all hope of finding any other survivors or of locating any fresh source of ammunition was fled. And now they were being channeled into an ever narrower field of flight by the mass firepower of the Whirlwind and Scorpius tanks the World Eaters had deployed to the flanks of their advance, bracketing all avenues of escape with withering fusillades of missile fire. Yet still, the Raven Lord did not order his legion to turn and face its pursuers, and make the last stand all knew must surely come, and soon. The Raven Lord kept his own silent counsel, and none dared raise a word of objection. Sunrise, such as it was upon the tainted, fog-shrouded surface of Istvaan 5, on the 98th solar day after the Drop Sight Massacre, saw the last 3,000 legionaries of the Raven Guard mount the crest of the final rise and look upon the endless expanse of the Gullers salt plains. The air was thick with toxins rolling in from the crusted plains, and the black contrails of whirlwind fire. The eerie howl of the tortured winds almost loud enough to drown out the bass roar of tens of thousands of World Eaters charging across the broken land. The Raven Guard survivors were finally backed into a literal corner. Now at last, the Raven Lord ordered his sons to halt. Backs to the Guller salt plains, the Raven Guard would make their final stand. They had survived for 98 days. They had fought with honor and determination, for no other course of action was possible. The Raven Guard had proven themselves loyal to the end, choosing survival over betraying their oaths, a choice which, historiator savants can be sure, never once occurred to the Primarch or a single one of his sons. The Raven Guard had been forged in the searing crucible of the Lycian uprising, where resistance, however futile, was the only option, even in the face of utterly crushing, hopeless oppression. Caught up in the wind-swept mountainside, Corax's legion remained resolute. Behind the peak stretched the great salt plains that had forced them into this last defiant stand. Ahead of them massed the might of the World Eaters, the rage-driven Astartes legion of Angron, who strode at their head, roaring for the blood of his brother. A sea of white and blue, World Eater Astartes, spattered with the red of gore, swept up from the valley, intent on the destruction of the Raven Guard. Maddened by their neural implants and driven into a battle frenzy by inhuman cocktails of stimulants, the berserk warriors of the World Eaters pounded up the sloping mountainside with their tanks and guns providing covering fire, every warrior bellowing his eagerness to fulfill the blood oaths they had sworn to his Primarch. As Angron's savage challenge rose above the roar of his legionaries, and the first of the traitor's bolt shells struck amongst the Raven Guard's ranks, Corax issued what all assumed would be his final orders to the last of his proud legion. Here the Raven Guard would stand. Here the Raven Guard would die. But now fresh thunder split the skies above the last battlefield of Istvaan 5, and with it came black-winged charnel birds, which fell in a fire-spitting flock from the tumult above. Their wrath unleashed not upon the few who remained to the Raven Guard, but instead upon the World Eaters, whose reckless headlong charge to finally grapple with their foe left them exposed before these birds of prey. A swath of detonations cut through the ranks of the World Eaters, ripping through their advance companies. Incendiary bombs blossomed in the heart of the approaching army, scattering white-hot promethium over the steep slopes. Corax looked on with incredulity as blistering pulses of plasma descended from orbit, cutting great gouges into Angron's legion. The roar of jets became deafening as dropships descended on pillars of fire, black dropships emblazoned with the badge of the Raven Guard. The loyalist legionaries scattered to give the landing craft space to make planetfall. As soon as their thick hydraulic legs touched the ground, their ramps wind down and boarding gateways open. The Raven Guard met their rescuers in stunned disbelief. These dropships were part of a desperate rescue mission that had been devised by Commander Nev Braun, a Raven Guard captain who had been left in charge of the Legion's homeworld of Deliverance. Without further delay, the Raven Guard survivors quickly prepared their escape aboard the dropships, breaking for orbit and leaving behind the frothing berserkers of the World Eaters, their angry Primarch futilely baying for loyalist blood. In a storm of shot and shell was Angron denied his bloody prize a final time. In fire had the Raven Guard been almost exterminated, and now in fire were the Raven Guard delivered from Istvaan 5, the world the War Master Horus had sought to make their tomb. Corax never knew how Braun had managed to make his way to Istvaan 5, but he was grateful for the rescue. Braun himself was reluctant to reveal what led him to Istvaan 5, and considered the topic sensitive since he had only acted after repeated, inexplicable prophetic dreams seen by Marcus Valerius, prefector of the Therian cohort, the Imperial Army regiment originally mustered on the planet of Theron, which was part of the Raven Guard's expeditionary fleet. Against the will of his masters, Prefector Valerius risked all to make for the Istvaan system, acting on a certain belief that the Loyalist mission had failed and the Raven Lord was in dire need of rescue. In order to launch his rescue attempt, Valerius had first to convince Commander Braun of its necessity, a challenge which very nearly cost the Prefector his life. Yet he prevailed, and the 1,000 Raven Guard legionaries tasked with guarding Deliverance, as well as the Therian cohort, made the impossible arduous voyage across half the galaxy and more. The rescue force arrived in Istvaan 5 at the very moment the World Eaters were sweeping down on the last of the Raven Guard survivors, its dropships snatching them away from the very teeth of death. That a voyage of over 50,000 light years should result in such a timely rescue is beyond comprehension for many. There are some in the present age who claim that it could have only come about through the intervention of the Emperor himself. Resigned to his fate, Corax felt that deadly absolution at the hands of Angron would have been a righteous end for the 19th Legion. But with all things considered, the Raven Lord was glad that he would survive to fight in the Emperor's name again. Well, folks, that be it this week. I promised you a story of honor, determination, and tenacity, and I do believe I delivered. Join us next week for our final bonus Vox on the Horus Heresy. Well, for at least a while, because our next subject was recommended by Commander Blaster, who suggested
The Siege of Medusa.
have a great day. And if you like this Vox, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and follow. And if you like the rest of our stuff, feel free to join our membership program on our YouTube channel.
Tales of Asheraka.
So long, and as always,
Until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.